Oh, Carlton's muted.
There. Is that better?
Yeah, you're coming in a little quiet.
Okay. Well, sorry about that. I'll try and speak up.
Okay, that's perfect right now.
Okay. And so you guys know I do have the chat window open on the side of my screen. So if you have questions as we go along, I will try and cast my eyes over to it from time to time and try and answer your questions in line. Today, I am going to give you a technical preview of what is in Informix version 15. Spoiler alert, this is the exact same talk that I'll be giving on December 3rd for the general IBM announcement of Informix 15. So you're getting a preview, if you will, of what we're doing. It has been a release long in coming, but I think the results will more than speak for themselves. HCL has done an amazing job in putting this together. What was a simple line item in our wish list, when I say our, I mean product management, IBM product management's wish list for HCL turned out to be many, many, many months of additional work that they didn't anticipate having to do. That said, we're really confident about this release. We're excited about it. We are all going to learn some interesting things about the engine through this release. And there is undoubtedly some best practices that will have to change because of what you can now do in Informix. So my hat's off to the entire HCL Actian development team for putting this together, and to Shri in product management, who has been shepherding this along with myself through the release process and everything that's gone around with bringing a new version of Informix out. So anyway, let's jump into this. Also, I want to thank the beta testers who spent their time and many, many months kicking the tires and finding bugs and other things along the way. So, oops, let's do this. There we go. Okay, so Informix 15 was just released earlier this week. It was a little bit later than we had planned. There were some gremlins in the IBM release system that needed to be vanquished. And those gremlins showed up at the very end, but we managed to get through it. And I can confidently say that version 15 represents perhaps the third largest change to the Informix engine that's ever happened. Now, let me establish a framework here. I am not counting version 7 as one of those. I consider version 7 with the DSA architecture and so forth the foundation for what I will call modern Informix. So yeah, version 7 was a huge change, but that's the foundation I'm working off of. We obviously have version 9 with the integration of the object-oriented technology and all of the benefits and features and so forth that came with that. Version 10 would probably be the second change because it involved increasing limits and other scalability features that really put Informix on the map, if you will, as far as being capable of being a large database system. Now, yes, version 11 had a lot of new functionality added to it, but in terms of changes to the infrastructure, to how Informix works, this is probably the third largest release we've had. So again, my hat's off to the development team for all the work that they put into making this happen. So I'm just going to give you a brief technical overview of what's in it. My plan is to do deep dives either in person at various places around the world or through webcasts in the coming year that will get into far more technical details than what I'm going to show here today. So first up, these are the lists of the supported operating systems for 15. Now, sharp-eyed people, I'll point this out. Solaris and HPUX are not on this list. Solaris has now been moved to the out of support list for version 15 and higher. It is still somewhat supported on 14. HPUX, of course, we dropped support for that earlier in the version 14 life cycle. but these are the supported OSs. The numbers that are in bold, for example, AIX 7.2 or RHEL 8.4, those are what we call our build platforms. So these are the platforms that we actually compile the software on, and then the other versions that are shown have certifications for them. Now, Windows, we don't have, at least I don't have what the build platform is, because Windows not available at this time. Windows will be following in a month or so, and we'll have a better idea then. Well, we'll know by then what the build platform is going to be. So for those of you who are looking to move to 15, these are the OSs that you'll be able to run with it. One of the big things that is changing is how we're actually numbering Informix. And this is taking effect from version 15 moving forward. Now, you guys are all familiar with the original numbering scheme where we had, a version number followed by an XYZ string that listed what the bit depth was and the type of release and was it a fixed pack and all that sort of stuff. So with 15, that goes away because we are adopting IBM's standard of the VRMF format, which stands for version number, release number, mod pack number, and fixed pack number. Now, there's still an identifier for special builds that will follow a fixed pack if you have this. But this represents a significant change in how Informix is going to be supported moving forward. So let me talk about this in just a little bit. As you might expect, a version or a release pack will have either some to significant functionality added to it. And in terms of technical support for Informix, it will be based off combinations of versions and releases. So for example, what we have just released is version 15.0.0.0. And there will be an end of life for 15.0.0.0. When 15.1 is released, because it's a different release pack, it will have its own end of life as well, which will be different from 15.0's. And so that's how we're going to drive end of support dates. Okay. Where it gets really interesting now is in the mod pack, the fixed packs, and the special builds. So a mod pack is basically going to be a collection of earlier fixed packs. So it's an integration, it's a full system test of all of the earlier fixed packs that have come before it. And when we come out with a new mod pack, the fixed pack number will reset to 1 for that release moving forward. A fixed pack is obviously bugs and other things that we have found along the way, and they are either specific releases for a particular bug. But here's the interesting piece. It's also an integration of all the special builds that precede it. So let's say we're on 15.0.0.1, and you have 2 or 3 special builds. When 15.0.0.2 comes out, that fixed pack will have all of your special builds plus any other special builds that have been created for other customers. So it is an amalgamation of all of the bug fixes to date. And here's where it gets interesting. Once 15.0.0.2 comes out, your fixed pack becomes and your fixed pack is included in that release. Your fixed pack becomes unsupported after 90 days. So it's the IBM policy to try and get people off of fixed packs and get them into fully integrated releases. So if you were to call up and say, hey, yeah, I'm on, such and such a release with this fixed pack number, this special build number, and a succeeding fixed pack is out there, you will be politely asked to upgrade to the fully integrated version of the engine. And this is to keep people from living on fix packs for years. And I won't name any customers by name, but there are a number that have parked on a fix pack and stayed there for many, many years, even though it's been integrated into successive releases. So that is a huge change to what to how Informix is going to be supported. Similarly, the JDBC and ODBC drivers are being renumbered as well. So there is a CSDK V15 and a JDBC V15, and I strongly encourage you to only use the V15 connectivity drivers with the V15 engine. As you're going to see in a few minutes, there are quite a few internal structures within the engine that have changed. And there's a strong possibility that it will break early versions of the connectivity drivers. And so it is anticipated that 15.0.0.1 will be released sometime before the end of the year. Obviously, I can't give you an exact date, but we are already working on bugs that have been found since we did code freeze. And so this whole process of updating the engine and the numbering scheme is now in effect. Some of you may ask, well, what does this mean for version 12? As of today, version 12 is still fully supported, but if you're familiar with the IBM process, it's always current release -1. So that would be version 15 is current release, -1 would be version 14.10. Where does that leave version 12.10? It is reasonable to assume, and you can read through in between the lines, if you will, that sometime next year, most likely early next year, there will be an announcement of end of support for version 12. Now, what that means is, because the support mechanism has changed as well, we will announce a date. Let's say it's April 30th for just, and I'm making up a number. That does not mean that's when we're going to announce it, but it's a nice end of quarter date. So we will announce on April. We announce on April 30th. You will have 1 full year from that date of standard support. In April 30th of 2026, then the product will go end of support, and you'll fall into the extended and enhanced support mechanisms that are available. And I have a whole talk that explains how the new support mechanism works as well, that I'll be giving as part of my deep dives and what do you want to call it? Roadshow sessions. So anyway, that's just a preview of what's happening with 12. So if you're on 12, you're still supported, but I would definitely make plans to migrate to a supported version, and that's either 14 or 15. Okay, here's some other stuff that kind of changed. Version 15 requires Java 11 or higher to function properly. IHQ version 3, which you just saw, requires version 11 or higher to work at all. But if you want to install Informix or use any of the functionality, you must be on version 11 or higher. Now, on 11, while you can install the headless version of the JRE, for it to actually work properly, you need the full JRE install. Now, you can have both pieces installed, as you can see on my screen here. I have both, but you actually need the full JRE for it to work. So we have deprecated support for Java in the engine in, I think it was 1410 FC8, I think. I've got Alzheimer's, so I can't remember all the dates. But with 15, you are definitely having to manage your own Java releases, which means you can upgrade anytime you would like for the functionality that that version of Java provides, and the engine will be okay with it. For the CSDK, you still have the same choices that you did before. You can either use the GS kit or the Open SSL for in the installation process. Now, the engine itself, even though it says you want to use OpenSSL, only installs the GS kit. The ability to use or install the OpenSSL drivers is only available on client-side installs. So if you're installing this in the same directory as the engine, the installer will understand that there's an engine there and will only install the GS kit. But in client installs, you can choose to install either one. We do not install OpenSSL itself, except on Windows. But what we do is we actually configure, configure the product to use either GSKit or OpenSSL. If you're using local key stores with the .p12 suffix on it, OpenSSL and GSKit support the same key stores, so you don't need to make any changes there. You will have to update the stash files, though, for the key stores to work. If you're using the GSKit's proprietary KDB format, though, on a client, you will need to convert those to P12 key stores. And there's an example of the conversion command down below, which will help you run that, or which will help you make that change. Again, from development, this quote came from them, and it basically just says that the GSKit and the OpenSSL are just libraries that are used to support the protocol, and we don't care which one you use. We're going to support either one. You just have to make sure that your stash files and so forth are compatible with what the engine provides and functions with. So just a little clarity on that. And I'm sure Tom will go into that a little bit more detail when he talks about his configuring with OpenSSL talk in just a few minutes. Okay. So did anything change in the onconfig? Well, yeah, there were a number of changes in the onconfig. Some parameters were removed, some new parameters were added, and some have new default values. And these default values are critical in the new version of the engine. There is some functionality that will not work with the default values from earlier versions of the onconfig file. So I strongly encourage you to not just take your version 12 or your version 14 onconfig file, run it into 15 and start up the instance. Things might not work the way you anticipate them to work. Though, because this is Informix and we give you choices, you can either choose to look at the differences in the files line by line, or you can use this onconfig_diff utility that lives in Informix bin. This utility will take the two onconfig files and show you parameters that exist in one but not the other file, parameters that do not exist in one file but exist in the other, or differences in the configured values. So it makes it very easy and very handy to go through and look at two different source files, if you will, and see what's different between them. So in this example here, I am comparing a 15 onconfig.std file with a version 14 onconfig.std file. And you can see, for example, that in the fizzbuff, logbuff, and bar transfer size, that the default values have increased significantly from what are in 14. And so you need to be aware of those changes and make the changes in your version 15 onconfig file before you start it up. Or if you're migrating a 14 onconfig, you'll want to update that with the new values before you start up your instance in 15. Okay, so now let's get to the really big thing in the release, and I mean that literally, um, and that is storage scalability. So the central theme for 15 was virtually unlimited scalability. There were a number of customers through the years that have run into some of the limits within the engine. Now, in full disclosure, most cases were because the customers weren't adequately monitoring their instances. And oh, yeah, we really do mean you can only have 16 million pages in a partition. And they would just try and blow past that and just see what happens. And the result was never good. We'll just leave it that way. So when we sat down and started planning 15, we said, what are some of the biggest things that we could do to make the engine easier for people to manage and use? And one of them was to try and remove some of these limits that a lot of customers were running into. And so the goal was to make Informix the big data engine. Now, there's a positive and a negative to this. As you're going to see, we have dramatically changed a few things. And while that's great, you can store more data in the engine and so forth. It also means that you can continue to be really lazy if you want to and not monitor what's going on inside your engine and create some structures that are just obscenely large in size, which you won't be able to manage efficiently in the future. So this is kind of a good news, bad news story. There's some good things there, but you're going to have to be on your toes a little bit for this one. So we said, we want to make it big. And we said, well, there's big and then there's big. So how big are we talking about in terms of a storage capacity? It's half a yottabyte, okay? Now, I'll let that sink in for just a second because like most people, when I was looking at this, I said, well, what's a yottabyte? And what I found is that a yottabyte is the largest volume that is supported or is described in the International System of Units, the SI. It is equivalent to 1,000,000 trillion megabytes. Okay, and you can see it's some septillion size of bytes. We looked at what it would cost to actually implement this and found that it would cost you approximately 50 trillion US dollars to buy the amount of disk it would require to fill up an Informix instance. It would take the data centers to hold the disk would actually cover the entire state of Delaware and the state of Rhode Island. So it is perfectly reasonable to say that you will run out of money long before you run out of storage capabilities inside the engine. This makes Informix the largest data source available in the world. And we're actually being limited by some things inside the OS. And I'll show you this in a few minutes, but we could actually be significantly larger if the OSs actually gave us some more latitude to work. So, as the little cartoon at the bottom says, are you happy now? Because we've given you all the room you could ever want to have. So how did we get there? Now, again, this is going to be very high level. There will be a much greater detailed discussion in my breakouts and road shows and so forth. But the row size remains unchanged at 32 kilobytes for the moment. Read between the lines. We can and may at some point increase that length depending on what we find with the engine in today's configuration. Now, do you really need a row that's longer than 32 kilobytes? I don't know. To me, that sounds like really bad database design. But that limit has remained in place. But row IDs now have changed from 4 bytes to 8 bytes. And the engine will actually support both versions of row IDs. So as you're going to see in a little bit, there's going to be 2 different implementations of 15. There's what I call the legacy version, or what we refer to as infrastructure version 0. and it will have all of the limits and so forth from 14 in it. And then you're going to flip a switch to turn on a lot of this new functionality. And that's what we refer to as infrastructure version 1. So there are some tables that will always maintain a 4-byte row ID, and I'll talk about those in just a second. And then the newer table sizes, or the newer tables that are created in 15, will be using the 8-byte size. The engine will support both simultaneously, so there's no need to worry about which one is actually on your table. The engine itself internally is actually using an 8-byte container for all of the row IDs. So small tables, those that are being migrated over from 14, or you create as small, which I'll talk about in a minute, are still going to be in the 4-byte. But any new tables you create in an infrastructure version 1 instance will be considered large tables and will use the larger 8-byte row ID. And it's the sign bit at the very top of the ID that kind of identifies whether this is a 4-byte or an 8-byte row ID. I hear somebody else is off mute. Did you have a question you wanted to ask? Okay. Page size. Well, depending on what your page size is today, you could have had anywhere up to a 16 kilobyte page size. In version 15, we have significantly increased that page size. So you now have the option of using a 34, 64, 128, or 256 kilobyte page size. Now there's positives and negatives to that. Just because you've got more doesn't mean it's better, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But so you can now store larger rows or more of your larger rows in fewer pages because you can utilize these larger page sizes. Well, it's great that I've got a 256K page, but I can only store 255 rows on a page, right? Not in 15. So the 255 row per page has been increased to an effective limit of about 30,000. Now, theoretically, you can go up to 65,000 rows per page, but please don't try. We haven't done much testing above 30,000 rows per page. So unless you want to be a brave pioneer, don't push the limit here. Okay. Page offsets have been changed from 4 bytes to 8 bytes. Why? Because we've taken the 2-bit chunk number and turned it into an unsigned small int. And that allows us to have the increased page address size. The number of pages per partition used to be 16 million. It's now 140 trillion pages that you can have in a single partition, which is just an insane number. Like I said, this is where you start running into a condition where you may have a partition that's just too big to manage. Yes, you can have 140 trillion pages, but do you really want to do that? The chunk limit has been increased as well. The current limit was 4 terabytes. The new limit is now 9 petabytes for a single chunk. Now, the storage limit of version 14 is around 8.5 petabytes. So that means you could take a fully maxed out Informix instance and store it in less than one chunk of Informix 15. I mean, that's how big of a change this is. Could it be bigger than 9 petabytes? Absolutely. The work is there. We can increase that if we need to. The problem, though, is the OSLSeek function. If we're writing to flat files, so if we want to create a 9 petabyte chunk, LSeek can only read or write to 9 petabytes inside. So when LSeek gets increased, we may increase what the maximum chunk size is as well. Also, the number of chunks has increased from 32K to 65K. So you can now have 65K of 9 petabyte chunks in your environment, which you sit there and you just do the math. You just step back and look at it and you go, oh my heavens, what have we done? But one of the advantages to this, though, is now Informix can be your data lake. You no longer have to have all these separate data repositories scattered all over the place. And you have to keep them siloed because you can't store them anywhere as a contiguous unit. You can do it in Informix now. It is the data lake. So you can bring all the data in, and with our object-oriented technology, in many cases, we can store these complex data types in their native format, and you can just query Informix and get your answers as opposed to using some of these query federation engines and so forth. It's just amazing what we can do with Informix today. The index key size historically has been 3 kilobytes. You now have the ability to create an index that is 32 kilobytes in size if you are using a page size greater than 32 kilobytes. But again, I ask the question, do you really need an index that's 32K in size? Again, you really ought to look at doing some better database design, but that's just my own personal bias. Page timestamps have changed as well, and there is a very important benefit to this. It's changed from 4 bytes to 8 bytes, and what that means is that incremental backups now work as designed. With a 4-byte timestamp, we were seeing the timestamps roll over very quickly. In some cases, depending on what the engine or the processor speed was and so forth, that timestamp could roll over once or twice in the course of a day. And so you went and you tried to do, let's say, a level 2 backup. Well, the page timestamp values were invalid, and you ended up doing a level 0 anyway, even though you'd asked for a level 2. With this longer 8-byte timestamp, we estimate it will take about 50 years for the timestamp to roll, which means that your level 1s, your level 2s, and your level 0, level 1s, level 2s now work as designed. If you ask for a level 2, you're only going to get those pages that have actually changed since the level 1. So that will have an impact on your backup and restore process. You should see some pretty dramatic changes in your media usage because of this, which is a good thing in my opinion. So those are the highlights, if you will, of some of the major changes that we made in the engine. So let's take a look at some of these in a real live operating environment. So in an engine, if you're in infrastructure version 1, you can have a combination of legacy page sizes and new page sizes. So you can see, for example, the root DB space and the logical log DB space are 2K in size, and any of the critical DB spaces have to use the default page size. But you can see that data space 1, 2, and 3 are using the new 256K page size. So, it's perfectly legal, it's perfectly fine to intermingle different size pages within the instance. As you might expect, if you create a 256K page size, you're going to get a 256K buffer pool to go with that. And it can be managed just like all the other buffer pools that you've had in the past. But as I was saying earlier, okay, it's great that we give you more size. If some is good, is more even better? And the answer to that in many cases is we don't know. There are some cases where a 256K page size is less efficient than using smaller page sizes. And this is just an example. So yeah, on a single 256K page size, you may cut out a number of headers and timestamps and so forth. You may decrease IO because you're getting more rows per page read. But if your row sizes are fairly small, then your slot table overhead now becomes more important. And you can see that taking on a 2K page size with a 10 byte row, that we can fit approximately 18,000 rows on a 2K page size. But on a 256K page size, we can only fit 14,000 rows on the page. So you're going to have to pay very close attention to table sizing with these larger page sizes, and ensure that you're not going to actually be wasting more space than you were with smaller or the standard page sizes. And there are a number of worksheets out there that can help you figure out how many rows per page and how much wasted space you'll have on a page and so forth. So again, I said earlier, you're going to need to be on your toes. This is just one example of why you need to look at this stuff cautiously and make sure that you're using it efficiently. You know, from development, the bottom line is we don't know in the real world what these larger row sizes, or excuse me, page sizes and so forth are going to mean for you. We need to see what actually happens in real world situation. We know what theoretically is possible, but we will be excited to hear your successes and failures and in using it. And with that, we will obviously be updating best practices as we go along. So feel free to share as you play around with this and test it, so that we can know what's working and what isn't. Larger chunk sizes and a number of pages per partition. So this is an example of an 11 terabyte chunk using a 2K page size. As I said, the new limit is now 9 petabytes. In this test system, the developer created an 11 terabyte chunk, and it worked just fine. So the 16 million pages per partition, like I said, that limit has now been expanded to 140 trillion. This is an example of a test load that was interrupted after 33 million pages were loaded into a single partition. So yeah, this actually does work, and works quite well, as a matter of fact. Index size. So again, it's now 32 kilobytes, upgraded from the original limit of 3 kilobytes. Unlike data pages, which can have home and remainder pages, an index page must be fully stored within whatever, or an index entry has to be fully stored within the page to which it is written. And inside baseball here, for an index to be created successfully on a page size, we actually have to be able to store 5 index entries per page, or the index won't build. You'll get an error saying that the page size is incompatible. So if you want to use a 32 kilobyte index size, you can only create those on a 256K page size, because that allows us to create 5 index entries per page. But you can see here, I have a 28 kilobyte row. I try and create the index on a 16K page size, I think. Yeah, 16K page size, database 4, and it fails because we can't, it's bigger than the page size. Yeah. But if I create it on a 256K page size in data space 2, the index is created and you're off and running. Let's see, there's some questions here. Did we change or increase the limit in the pseudo table? I believe we did. Yes, we would have to in order for it to, in order for us to store that many number of rows. Okay, So how do you get to these larger limits, or what we refer to as infrastructure version 1? First thing you need to know is that if you take an existing Informix instance and you migrate it to version 15 um, using an in-place migration process, which we'll talk about in a minute, it will come up in infrastructure version 0. This is what we refer to as compatibility mode or legacy mode, or whatever you want to term it. In infrastructure version 0, you can use the reversion functionality to move back to version 14 if you need to. So you can take your instance, move it up to 15, play around with it. If you don't like it, you can revert back using the standard reversion mechanism. There is a specific command that you need to execute that triggers conversion of the instance to infrastructure version 1. And once that is triggered, you cannot use the reversion functionality to move back. You will have to take your level 0 backup and restore that, the level 0 backup that you created prior to making the change. And you'll have to restore from that backup to move back to your earlier version of Informix. Okay. So there are some table elements, even in 15, that will not change. And these, I'll talk about what those are in greater detail in my road shows. There are some table elements that will remain the same in terms of page sizes. And these are specifically the system related tables. So your system, your sysmaster and sysadmin databases, the table space, and so on and so forth. These will never change, regardless of whether you're in IV0 or IV1. Okay. And how you get to these larger limits and so forth, like I said, I'll talk about in greater detail. Now, with this change in row sizes and number of rows per page, or not row sizes, because these page sizes and other overhead that's changed in the engine, there is a new fix pack of 4GL and ISQL that will be released shortly that is compatible with these new 8-byte header IDs and timestamps and other changes that occurred in the infrastructure of the engine. And again, if you're using 15 and you're using 4GL and ISQL, strongly encourage you to upgrade to that fix pack in order to use version 15. Unlike the engines, 4GL and SQL will retain the numbering versions that they have today. So it's going to be a version 7.3. something when these new versions come out. Okay, so does it make a difference if you're migrating with or without replication? The answer to this is yes. So there are significant changes to the Informix 15 kernel, as you would expect. And as a result, there's a very specific process that you have to follow to migrate your instance to 15. So I've already said, if you take your existing instance, you can do an in-place migration, provided that you take care of all the prerequisites, and it will come up in IV0. Again, then you flip the switch to the larger limits and you cannot roll back. Okay, here's the big thing that you have to do before you try and do an in-place migration. And that is, you have to make sure there are no in-place alters in existence anywhere in the instance. It was highly recommended when you migrated between different versions or different fix pack, but it's absolutely required for 15. And you might ask, Carlton, how do you know that it's required in V15? Well, I might have run into this multiple times when I was migrating and testing between 14 and 15. So if you have any in-place alters in existence anywhere in the instance, the conversion will fail, it will abort, nothing will happen. It will actually shut down the instance, and you'll get some nasty messages that you have to go back and restart the instance from your earlier version of Informix, there's a whole bunch of information written in directories that you'll have to remove before you try and remigrate again. And like I said, there will be more information in my deep dives on this, but you absolutely, absolutely must make sure there are no in-place alters. So how do you tell if you have an in-place alter anywhere? Well, you've got to check for IPA task in the database scheduler that I believe it's currently disabled by default. So you can go ahead and turn that on, let it run for a couple of days and so forth. And then you'll get a list in the PH alert table for tables that have these existing IPAs. Or you could manually go out and look at every single table you've got with an onCheck -P capital T, and you want to check for the data page version summary section, because it will show as what the different IPAs are. So in this particular case, I've got 5 different versions of the row for this particular table, version 0 through 4, and you can see the number of rows that are using each of the different row versions and so forth. So you need to consolidate all of those to the most current version of the row. How do you do that? Well, you can go through and do an update table, set column 1 equal to column 1. Basically, the rows have to be rewritten in the new format. Art Cagle does have a utility in his repertoire that I believe is out in the IUG library that also goes through and identifies tables with IPAs and runs a process to get those updated to the current version. So, whichever one you want to use, you must do that. When you are ready and you have migrated your existing instance into 15 and IV0, you've worked with it, you like how it's working so far, but you want to trigger now all of the new limits, you have to execute one of 5 different workflows. So this is Informix. We give you choices, right? So here are your 5 different choices to get to infrastructure version 1. It could be an on-tape command. It could be an on-mode command. There are a couple of different on-bar commands that you can run, or you can use the system API. In every single case, I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to have at least 1, if not 2, level 0 backups before you ever execute this command, just in case you want to move back. In some cases, these workflows actually create a fake backup for you and then make the trigger. But again, wear your belt, wear your braces, make sure that you have backups of your backups of your exports of your backups, just so that you have a way of getting back. So like I said, during the deep dives, I'll provide a lot more information on how you actually migrate. You'll see errors in migration. You'll see how you correct those. I mean, there will be a lot more detail in that. Likewise with replication. I'll talk about the differences between replication, whether you're using ER or the HA cluster. Briefly, ER cluster, you'll be able to migrate over without much in the way of problems or issues. There is a specific workflow that you need to follow, however, in order to preserve your ER cluster and so forth. And like I said, I'll talk about all of that in greater detail. Where it becomes less pleasant is if you are using the HA cluster. We are rebuilding the SysMaster database as part of the migration for 15. And unfortunately, HA cluster definitions are lost in that rebuild. So obviously you want to migrate your HA cluster primary first, as you'll see again in the deep dive and webcasts and so forth. When that instance gets migrated into 15, whether it's an IV0 or not, it's going to come up as a standalone instance. It will not understand, it will not know anything about previously existing HDR secondary or any RS secondaries, and you will have to rebuild the cluster again from scratch. IFX clone is going to be your friend here in getting those secondaries rebuilt, but that is a pretty big need to know about 15 before you migrate. Okay, so what else did we change in 15? One of the things that has been lagging is our global language support. So in 15, we've updated our GLS to whatever this ICU 4C 71.1 is. Again, I'm not a global language support expert. I'm barely competent to say global language support, but there are a number of changes in this particular version of the GLS. And of course, all the earlier preceding features prior to 71.1 are available to you, which means that you can utilize these now for your applications to make them richer for whatever language set you are using. And you know, that's about all I am competent or qualified to say on this particular topic. So one of the other things we're doing is giving you the ability to get the query plan of a running query. Before this, you had to either do a set explain on, avoid execute, and try and get the query plan, or wait until the query was over in a session and then try and interrogate after the fact. Now, while a session is running, while a query is running, you will be able to grab its query plan. And because this is Informix, we give you choices. You can either use an onstat flag to get it, or there's now an additional column in the sys explain pseudo table. So is there a difference between them? Yes, there is. With the onstat flag, you will get the full query plan, regardless of how large it is. If you use the sys explain pseudo table, you will only get about 32K of the query plan. Why? Because the row length for any row in Informix right now is still 32K. So the row that we write into sys explain can't be any larger than that. Now then, these operations do not contain runtime statistics. The query is still running, so we don't have a full view of everything that's going on, but we can provide you some looks inside to see what's happening. So with the onstat command, the new flag is a Q plan, so -G Q plan, which I think makes 105 or 106 of the possible options for onstat. It's just the utility that keeps on giving. You can either then pass it a specific session ID that you're interested in, or a 0 to get all of the query plans for the active queries in the instance. So here I've got session number 40 out there. I can do the onstat command, pass in session 40, and look and see what that particular query is doing with the query path, with the index paths and sequential scans and all that fun sort of stuff. The estimated costs of what the query optimizer think it's going to cost is returned as part of this. If you do a Q plan 0 or just a Q plan null, like I said, you'll get every query that's running in the engine for all session. And if a session isn't running a query, we'll identify that the session is there, but nothing is happening within it. To get the data from the sys explain table, you simply select the column with the session ID that you're interested in. And so this is an example of querying out of the table. Now this, like I said, you'll only get the first 32K of the query plan in the column, but you can access it this way. Notice that there are a number of runtime statistics that are listed with -1. Do you think there could be a way that we might be able to get real-time updates on this? Come to my deep dive sessions or my road shows, and I'll go into how you might be able to tweak the command a little bit to get actual runtime stats as the query is progressing. Yeah, and so this is just, wait, there's more information coming. This is just an overview. One of the other things that we did, I feel like this is a late night TV salesman, but wait, there's more. There are times when it would be nice to know, well, what is the impact or lack thereof of an index on a query plan? And it has been, customers have tried to remove an index and add an index and play around and see, well, what difference does it make? And historically, there were only 3 workflows for this, and not all of them were all that great. So the first one was an explicit directive where you would go into the SQL statement itself. So you'd have to rewrite the statement and put in these explicit directives of, do this, don't do that, try this first, and so on and so forth. And okay, yeah, that's great, but you have to rewrite the SQL statement. And if you have an existing application, particularly a purchased application, that's not always possible. Second option was to use an external directive where you put the SQL statement in a library, and for that entry, for that SQL statement, you write how you want the query to be processed within the engine. Problem with this is it slows down all queries inside the instance, because every single query that gets processed, we have to check the library to see if it's matched in there and pick up the directives for it. So that wasn't a good solution necessarily either, particularly for those who really valued speed and performance. The third option was disabling the index, which was great, certainly took the index offline, but the problem is it also changed how the index functioned. Any DML changes to the table that would have resulted in changes to the index were not updated, which meant that there was no re-enable an index, if you will. You had to drop the index and rebuild it from scratch. So again, yeah, you could get the index out of the way really quickly, but trying to put it back in involved a lot of work and a lot of pain. So what did we introduce in version 15? A new syntax flag that makes an end user index invisible or visible at the drop of a hat. So notice that I have specifically called out end user index. We'll talk about that in just a second. Now, it does require resource permissions on the database to execute this command, but you can create an index now. The default is obviously visible, because if you create the index, we assume you want to use it, but you can also create an index in invisible mode and then just trigger it to be visible if you want to test. Or if you have existing indexes, you can turn either a specific index visible or invisible, or all indexes for a table to be visible or invisible with a simple SQL statement. Now, like I said, this only works for end user indexes. If you have a system generated index or a system generated constraint, because you said, create table, blah, 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 create, primary key or whatever the case might be, and the instance created the index for that constraint or for that object, you know that it doesn't have a regular name associated with it. Well, in my 1210 FC8 and some of my earlier 14 presentations, I talked about how you can convert system-generated indexes or system-generated constraints to use end user naming conventions, at which point those indexes can now be made visible or invisible. So if that's important to you, that's the workflow that you'll need to use to get past the restriction on invisibility. When an index is made invisible, it is still maintained, which is a huge plus over disabling an index. So you can make an index invisible, you can load the thing up with 1 million new rows. When you make the index visible again, those 1 million rows will be in the index. So tremendous time saver on using this as opposed to the other workflows. So how does it work? So here's just some examples. I've got an index, it's index 122. So I simply say, make the index invisible. Once I've done that, if I do a DB schema on that table, you can see that the state of the index has been changed in the DB schema command itself. It's now marked as invisible. If you go to the sys indices, not the sys indexes, but the sys indices table, you can see that there's now an index attribute flag. If it is set to 16, the index is invisible. If it's null, then the index is visible. Likewise, if you go to the sys object state table, there's a new visible column, which will be populated for indices. It will either be visible yes or visible no. If there is a dash in that column for that particular index, then that's a system-generated index, which or system-generated object, which we can't modify. And then, like I said, if you want to change that, you're going to have to go through the modification process that I talked about earlier. So quick way of looking at whether or not indexes are visible or invisible. And like I said, I will show more details on invisible indexes and how it changes a query plan and so forth in the deep dives. I just don't have the time to do it today. As a matter of fact, I think I'm running long as it is, so I apologize. So, oh, well, here's the last thing I'm going to cover, and that's IHQ. I'm just knowing that there was going to be a session on IHQ today. This is just a brief overview. It's been upgraded to version 3. If you're using any current version of IHQ released prior to 1410 FC8, you must follow a specific upgrade process described in the FC8 deep dive to migrate your H2 databases, which hold all the information about IHQ, to a version 3 compatible environment. If you don't, you'll corrupt your IHQ and you'll have to start over. I've already talked about Java 11 being required. And again, some of the new features, have already been talked about. There's infrastructure changes. One of the things that's new is light mode, so you can have light mode or dark mode. ER, there has been a change to IHQ in terms of administering enterprise replication. There's now some point and click options to building clusters and replicates and so forth. So that's what I have for today. I hope this has been of value to you. And I will look now at the questions here. 5 node minimum per page for an index. That's 5 key values. So we have to be able to store 5 key values on the page. So Art said he would provide his fix IPA script. Okay. Yeah, are there any other questions you'd like to ask at this point?
I think there's one more about the LO HDR part N. Did that change or not?
Off the top of my head, I would say yes, but it's not something that I've looked specifically at. I think it would have to, because if you choose to put your large objects in different page sizes, they're going to need to have the appropriate header information.
So I'm gonna jump in on one thing. I did just check the version 15, both the engine and the CSDK are available on the Informix download site, as well as if your enablement in Passport Advantage. So it should be up there as well.
Yeah. Oh, good. We talked about that yesterday.
Yeah,
Wasn't there yesterday.
It looks like it popped up this morning. So yeah, that is available if you want to start working with it.
And in fair play, the HCL version of Informix 15 is also available. what's the difference between the HCL version and the IBM version? Just the splash screens. The engines are functionally identical. Just depends on who you want to buy through.
Got a question on opening cases for version 15.
Okay. How do you open a case? Same way you open a case for 14 or 12. Call support, tell them what your version number is, and go from there. They are ready. They are trained. They are accepting support cases as of Tuesday.
That's great. I think that's it. So again, there's going to be more detail on the next talk. One other question just popped up.
Can you migrate from 12 to 15? In theory, yes, you can. But I would do so before 12 is marked as end of support. I only tested from 14 to 15. In the lab, I believe they tested 12, 14, and up. Again, there's a lot that you're going to want to check in the onconfig files, and really pay attention to the new defaults. There again, in the deep dives, I'll show what some of the steps are that occur during migration, and you'll see that there's some specific migration steps that occur using 12.10 functionality. There's some specific functionality that is executed using 14.10 functionality. So yes, it's supported. You should be good to go. But as always, have a backup of your backup of your export of your backup, just in case you need to move back. Yes, you can use reversion, but it doesn't hurt to have have an extra copy of the data lying around.
One other thing on the upgrading from 12 to 15 is note that the operating system compatibility charts are different, especially between 12 and 14, and then 14, 15, I think are pretty close, but still double check to make sure that you're going to be running a supported OS once you go up to 15. I've had a number of clients that did the 11 to 12 upgrade, and then when they looked at 14, they realized their OS was no longer supported. So just be mindful of that.
Good catch on that one. In terms of PDF manuals for V15, I have no idea. My guess is no, just because IBM is trying to get out of creating manuals. But I will ask and see.
So the online documentation, do we have any schedule on the updates on that?
It's live. It's live. Okay. Yeah, I was poking through it yesterday. It's live and ready to go.
So question for you is there anything about the roadshows that you wish to plug or share information about? I know it may be early.
Just that, look for announcements. They won't start before February of next year, just because everybody needs to get through end of year, first of year stuff. But my goal is to do a number of them, and in various places around the world, provided that I'm able to get there, and where I can't, or if it doesn't look like it's possible, then I'll do a series of deep dive webcasts, as I've been doing all throughout version 14. So just keep your eyes peeled.
And we will heavily promote those with the IUG and the WAG. If you have not been to one of Carlton's roadshows before, if you at all can make it, it is very, very, very worthwhile. really, deep dive is an understatement, where you'll learn all kinds of stuff you had no idea about that you'll be able to take back and make real use of back in your organization. So, anyone have any other questions? All right, Carlton, thank you so much. So excited that this worked out, and that we were able to do this. 2 days after release announcement, we weren't sure if this was going to be before or after. So, thank you. Really appreciate all of this. We had one more question on end of support on 12. Got covered earlier. That will be announced at some point. So it'll be 12 months after the announcement. So, all right, thank you so much. I'm gonna take control here, and I get to jump in and do mine. Actually, one other good question for you, Carlton. Is there any general idea on how frequently fix packs or new sub releases will come out?
Well, like I said, 15001 is anticipated before the end of this year. We will tend to follow the same release schedule that we've had in the past, which is a fixed pack every quarter, if I were to guess. A lot depends on what we find, though. So if customers start calling in because they're using it and discovering things, and we're having to create special builds and so forth, we may push fix packs out faster, just so that we can get those special builds integrated into the full, tested version of the engine, to bring that functionality to customers faster. But I would say possibly every quarter for a fix pack, mod packs maybe twice a year. And then obviously the release and versions will be on a much broader length of time.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm gonna go ahead and swap over as I cough. I'll go ahead and stop.